Hello, right. So, well, it's excellent to see so many of you here, especially for this joint lecture with the Northern Regional Group of the Geological Society of London. For those of you who haven't been here to the Institute before, we are the North of England Institute of Mining and Mechanical Engineers. We go back to 1852, and you are more than welcome to continue hello, David. To come to all of our events as well, and I shall shortly be cornering you for membership. Just a few notices to start off. Steve does this so well, so I've had to make a list. Don't forget to sign the book as you've come in. I believe we've had people on hand making sure that you have. In the event of fire, the exits are there. And please don't forget to turn off or mute any mobiles you've got going as well. Just to say, by way of interesting engineering things, earlier today I was at a conference in Durham with the Durham Institute of Research, Development and Innovation. There we are. A very interesting project that's very up and coming. And there I learned that the world's largest tea bag factory is actually in Teesside. And a few years ago, the physics department at Durham had to step in because something was going wrong with the tea bags. Apparently they'd talked to Cambridge and they'd messed it all up. So thankfully Durham was on hand to make sure that the world's largest supply of tea bags was suitably sealed up. So there's another bit of northern engineering for you on a different scale. But moving on to something far more serious, we'll just go on to a few notices and then we'll move on to the talk, and I'll introduce Scott in a moment. In terms of the last meeting, this was last Thursday actually, so you've got a bumper march of meetings. This was done by Duncan McSorland from Honeywell UOP on choosing the right type of carbon capture technology. Decent attendance, racking up the views quite rapidly. I think we've had quite a lot of positive feedback, particularly from the local branch of the Institute of Corrosion. That's a really good topic that they'd probably like to repeat at some point. Voted thanks, David Mobbs. Closing remarks, Steve Martin. So hopefully we can take that as a record of the last meeting. So, and just by way of notice, the next lecture will be on the 10th of April. That will be Bioleaching of Critical Metals by Dr. Anna Santos from the Natural History Museum. This is part of a wider project. The NHM have actually been going around to several sites internationally, seeing what they can do in terms of both mine remediation, but also how you can actually do the metallurgy, probably at a far lower cost by getting the biology to do it for you rather than any mechanics. If you want to find out more about our excellent lecture series, we're currently also in the process of approaching and getting speakers for our remainder of the 25-26 session. So if you have any suggestions at all, do please get in touch for interesting speakers or topics. But if you want to find out more, we're of course all online, got plenty of things going on, a lecture that you're at. Hopefully, if anyone has any conference proposals, do please corner me at the end. Annual dinner, various socials and CPD, and of course the occasional field trip. And perhaps if we have a joint field trip with the Northern Regional Group, that'd be excellent as well, Leslie. If you'd like to become a member, there's plenty of stuff on. We have various post-nominals, invitations, newsletters, discounts, all the usual, and also the opportunity to get involved. So if you'd like to add, I'm sure we've counted some excellent CPD points if anyone would like to get involved as well. Do please let us know. Just go to mininginstitute.org/uk/membership or corner me at the end and I'll give you a membership form. So moving on to the main thing of the evening. This is a delightful thing to do with many hats. Firstly, as president of the Institute, to welcome the local Northern Regional Group here, and also as a council member of the Geological Society of London. I know it's always good to do really put lots of things together for the local regional groups. There we are. And of course the regional groups do deserve the Society's support as well. And I believe Scott is also head of the Engineering Geology. Vice Chair of Engineering Geology as well. By way of introduction, it should be a very interesting lecture, particularly for its focus on issues to do with previous coal mines as well. But Scott O'Neill, Scott O'Neill is a technical director within Mott MacDonald's heavy civil infrastructure team. He's based in Birmingham. There's the Black Country badge proudly on the lapel there, and he's got over 25 years of experience with the assessment, investigation and remediation of mining hazards. And I'll leave Scott to do the rest.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for the introduction. He says struggling with his belt. So my name's Scott, and for the next 3 hours, I'm going to talk to you about mining. I need to start with this slide. So I really like looking at old mining plans, and I really like getting involved with looking and solving geotechnical and engineering geology problems associated with old mining. Be it coal mining or metalliferous mining, I just love a hole in the ground. But I do really think that as an industry, and I'm talking more about the civil engineering industry and the engineering geology industry at the moment, we lack a lot of knowledge. We're losing a lot of knowledge. And I think one of the things that I'm very keen to do is to try and capture that knowledge. And I'm very thankful to the people I was speaking to in the bar earlier. I've already written down 2 or 3 anecdotes, 2 or 3 little technical things that I'd never come across, but I've made notes of them and I'm sure I'll refer to them in future slides. I do like to say I am not an expert. People refer to me and they say, Scott O'Neill, expert in mining. I'm not. I'm just interested, and that's all it is. If I say anything tonight and you disagree with me or you've got an alternative point of view, please tell me. Because everything pretty much I'm going to speak about tonight, I'm either self-taught or people like Paul at the front have passed on their knowledge to me in knowledge transfer. And I think that's something that we really need to do as an industry much better than we currently do it. Okay, I always start with this. So if you've seen me talk before, I always put this, at least the one by Galloway on, and especially as I'm here, because Galloway talks very fondly of this part of the world. Essentially, we wouldn't have the modern world were it not for coal mining. I won't read it out. And I think a lot of people forget that. And I've got an anecdote that I gave a talk last year, perhaps about 18 months ago in Leeds. Very similar talk to this, so I apologise if you were at that one, you're going to get the same one again. And at the end of the talk, two young people in the profession came over to me and they said, that was a really interesting talk, Scott, thank you for that. Loved looking at the plans, very interesting, but why is this such a big deal? And I kind of said, what do you mean? They said, we don't get this. You've been talking about coal. Was coal a big deal in this country? Yeah, you see, but you laugh. But then think about it. That means we've got a generation of people that are joining the engineering community who don't understand the significance of this. And I know I never worked in a mine. I was never trained as a mining engineer. But I've tried to pick this up, and I think we need to remember that when we're looking at problems. I'm sure there's consultants in the room who deal with people, both clients, both internal colleagues and peers, who struggle to understand what we're talking about and why this is such a big issue. And I'm very conscious of time. So a few, oh, is that me again? Ooh, brave. So UK mining dates back to the Neolithic. I won't go through all of this here. I think there's a few important things that we need to talk about on this slide, which is that coal mines started as surface winning or small pits and then progressed. And then really, as I'm sure most people know here, it was the Industrial Revolution that really got the coal mining going in the UK. And in addition to coal mining, there are other minerals that were mined, and it's important to remember, and I'll try and remember to touch on this later on, that there were other minerals and there were other materials mined with the coal. So when we're talking about underground mining, we might not just be talking about the thickness of coal that you can see on a geological map. Okay, so it was a long time ago, but what sort of hazards? Now, what I have done tonight is I've mixed these slides up, and I'm hoping this order is going to work a little bit better than it has in the past. So before we get involved in mine plans and mine maps and assessments, why are we doing this? What's the issue? Well, we mined in the UK, and following on from that mining, we've got residual hazards. And again, I won't talk through these, but these are the sort of things that we're looking at. We're looking at mine water. We're looking at mine gases, which the Coal Authority or the Mining Remediation Authority are particularly concerned about. And at that point, I will just say, Mining Remediation Authority, Coal Authority, I'm going to get that confused. I apologise. I'm already struggling when writing mining risk assessments now, typing away, this MRA has been prepared for the MRA. So I'm sure a lot of people are dealing with that problem. So if I say Coal Authority, you all know where I'm going with that. We have the workings themselves, which is what a lot of this talk is going to be about, and then we have mine entries. I'm not going to cover shafts or adits or anything tonight. I just haven't got enough time. And then we've got colliery tips. I'm not going to talk about that. And fault reactivation, which is, if anybody has any experience of fault reactivation, I'd love to have a conversation with you afterwards. Because in the last few weeks, I've been talking to a couple of people who've possibly started to change my opinion about what might be going on with fault reactivation, and certainly with break lines and fissures. And then, so we take those hazards on the previous slide, and this is really what we're often talking about in consulting. We're talking about failure of the pillars at depth of some sort of failure, leading to some sort of surface expression. And so the reason I've got two images here, which are pretty much the same image, is I believe the one on the top left there, where we've got multiple pillar failure, if we can just bear that in mind when I start talking about longwall mining later, because I think that's quite a nice little illustration of potentially what could be going on around longwall mining. And then as we move, still talking about the top left image, as we move to the right-hand side, we've got something that might be associated with board and pillar mining, and I'll come on to that again in a minute. And then the bottom picture is a really nice little image, and so I've put that one in. Again, it illustrates the same sort of things, and I think it gives you an idea of the ground disturbance, which is something that is often ignored when we're talking about subsidence failure and how this might propagate to the surface. Again, just to illustrate the point further, crown holes, this is what a lot of people in the industry think about. You've all gone yellow, that's amazing. Crown hole failure is what a lot of people in the industry, in consulting, that's the immediate go-to when people talk about mining subsidence. It's this sort of manifestation, something that is relatively small, very, very localised, and is potentially a lot easier to deal with than some of the wider subsidence troughs that we saw on the previous slide. So just from the previous slides, we can say that when mining was completed, voids may remain in the ground. And if we go back, I suppose I didn't point that out actually. Here, no, there we go. We've got a water table on that bottom image. Actually, we've got a water table on both images. And it's important to consider that, hang on, let's start again with that. One of my interests is looking at old mining textbooks. I'm convinced that if we read the old textbooks about how to actually drive these mines, and I'm talking as old as I can possibly find, we can understand what we're looking at as engineering geologists, civil engineers and consulting engineers, and we can try and work out how best to investigate them, where best to put boreholes, where not to put boreholes, where subsidence may be at its maximum point or where it may not have occurred at all. And so what comes across in a lot of those textbooks, which is something that I perhaps hadn't really thought about until I really got interested in this 5 or 6 years ago, is that as an engineer, I was always told that mining subsidence was about the roof coming in. And that's not the case. It seems to be that the large majority of problems with mines, especially in pillar and store workings, was the floor coming up rather than the roof coming down. And that would be made, that problem would have greatly increased where we'd got the water table. Now obviously, I'll keep going forward now. Obviously where we've got the water table and we lower the water table through artificial pumping, that problem goes away temporarily. We switch the pumps off, the ground responds, we get a ground response. And this will run through the thread of the talk. Has that ground response completed now? We finished mining a long time ago, predominantly in this country, but we're now seeing groundwater rebound, and I think there's a chance that we might start seeing problems that we haven't seen before, which could be associated with that groundwater rebound. An obvious point, but the presence of workings will have a significant impact on the choice of foundations, for better or for worse. And one of the first takeaways for this evening, if this is something that you're unfamiliar with either in the room or online, is that if we ignore the information that is in front of us that we can go and research in these sort of environments, with these sorts of geotechnical and geological constraints and hazards, they will come back and bite us. And that's been proven on numerous projects over many, many decades. So this is the common thing in consultancy. We've got 10 times the seam thickness, it's not a problem. There's some mining there, we've got enough thickness. So if you're not aware of what the 10T rule, I will come on to it later on, but essentially there is a rule of thumb that's come, I understand, I know some people in the room might have been present when this was talked about initially, a rule of thumb that has been passed through Syria SP32 and now into Syria 758D, which are essentially the de facto standards for consultants in dealing with these issues. That if we have 10 times the seam thickness of coal in cover to the ground surface or to rockhead, depending on your point of view, there's not a problem. And I will come back to that. But before I talk about this, and this is here because I've got nowhere else to put this slide, but I can't do this talk without talking about bell pits. So bell pits are the first sort of real underground mining. So we find surface coal, we start to win it, we chase the coal into the ground, perhaps going down following the dip of the geology, and then we get into bell pitting where entrepreneurial sorts would go into a field where they knew there was coal at relatively shallow depth, dig a hole to the point where that hole became unstable, and then dig another hole. And I must thank Andrew Brown for that image on the left-hand side here, because I think that's a fantastic shot to show you how close. So each one of those black circles is a bell pit, and that's how close they were together. And so the reason they're black, the reason they look like coal, is that's the material that was then pushed back into the hole to fill it off once it was finished. But looking at this, you can see the variation in size, the variation in spacing. And one of my mentors once said to me that he'd read somewhere that the decision of where a new bell pit would start in relation to the old one was the distance you could throw the shoe when you came out of the ground. Now, I don't know if that's true. I've never seen that written down anywhere, but I do think it's a great story. Okay, so back on to the thread of things. So let's talk about mining plans. And this is just an introduction. And I put this in because I can't find this written down anywhere. This is something that I think should be included as part of geohazard courses in the universities that remain that teach geology and engineering geology. But certainly having this written down somewhere I think would be of great importance. And myself and Paul are looking at trying to capture some of this for the Geological Society going forward over the next few years. So ultimately what we're saying on here, again I won't read it all, is coal mining hasn't always had it hasn't always been a requirement to make plans of coal mines. Predominantly, the early plans were made more for a health and safety point of view. So if you were sinking a new shaft and you were going to work a seam, that you knew you weren't going to break into your neighbour's seam and potentially flood your workings, which obviously you were trying to avoid. And as mining progressed, and as incidents and accidents progressed, and as various mining legislation came in, there was a requirement in 1872 to make plans and deposit them. Now, my understanding of deposit means that they were taken to London. And so if you're in this part of the world in 1873, London is a long way away. And I wouldn't even like to consider how many plans never got to London, but I'm sure it's a sizable number. So we've got a whole suite of information that we've just lost because nobody took it to London in the first place. And it's important to bear in mind, and there's a point here, and it's on a later slide, that there is a point, and again, this is often missed in engineering consultancy, in my opinion. There is a difference between deposited plans and abandonment plans. Mining surveyors who used very, very crude methods, especially early on, ropes, chains, ropes that would get wet and lengthen, perhaps ropes where they'd cut off the end because they got frayed and then still say it was the same length. Mining surveyors would make a plan as the works progressed, and some of those plans have been retained. They would also be required to make a plan at the cessation of mining, and at the cessation of mining, that plan would be signed by the mine owner and the mine surveyor, although I would have to just check that. My mind's gone slightly blank. So the difference there is the working plan may be a deposited plan, while an abandonment plan shows the workings at the cessation of mining. Okay, so that sounds easy. So how do you tell the difference? I'll come on to how you tell the difference later on. But a theme that I'd like you, again, if we're going to talk about points to take away from tonight's presentation, The same seam of coal could have been worked repeatedly, and probably was worked repeatedly, by the same mining company or different mining companies through the years. And there's a reason for that, and I'll come on to that again later on. So one abandonment plan that has been signed and deposited may not actually be the ground conditions as they are now. And that's putting aside the fact that we're now talking about being 100 years later. What I'm trying to say here is that the mine plan that was deposited at any one point may not be the final record of what was mined underground. And then we start getting into why was that? Well, people could have gone in, there could have been illegal mining, there could have been trespass mining. Somebody thought a shaft was being closed up and they just chanced their arm perhaps one weekend or one evening to go and get a bit of coal for the home fire. So, mine plans. This is from the old Syria document. This shows various methods of working. My particular favourite, obviously because of where I'm from, is the bottom one, which is the Staffordshire Square work. I am trying to get hold of a really good plan of working in the Staffordshire Thick, showing this in a lot more detail with multiple workings. But we can see pretty much, whichever method you've got, there is a common similarity. There is an area of coal removed, there are pillars that are left in place. Depending on where you are in the country, depending on the age of the mine, that methodology may differ. And this is why I'd like to go back to the point I made earlier about understanding how the mines were driven to understand how to treat them. You can imagine that if you go into some of these, if you take that pillar and store one, the second one up from the bottom, if you're designing a ground investigation and you put in boreholes, if that ground investigation is on a regular grid and it's on the same regular grid as the pillars, you're probably going to hit a pillar, if the pillars are still there. So we can, and I know of at least one case where people have fallen foul of something very similar to that. Okay, right, what everybody's been waiting for, pretty plans. That's beautiful. So that's Sanker. That's up in just on the Scottish borders. It's a lovely plan. I will come back to this one later. I know Rob here knows this one pretty well as well.
Can I interrupt you for a second? You ever been in a room with somebody from Sanker?
No.
You have now.
There you go. Go on, give us a story then.
It's a mining village. It's an outlier of the actual coal field. Both my grandfathers worked there.
That's fabulous.
I'm from Sanker.
There you go. Sorry, your name, sir, was?
William. Sorry.
There you go. Super.
Oh, you're okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you see, this is what it's about. This is what it's about. I shall write that down now. So tonight, forevermore, whenever that slide goes up, William, you will be mentioned. So I'm sorry, if you're online or in the room and you're going to see me talk again, William's name will come up. So I think that's a lovely plan, and that plan is actually a lot bigger than that. And that's just, yes, hang on, let's go back to the actual point of the plan. That's very well drawn. That is very easy to read if you know what you're looking at. If you're designing a ground investigation, if you're working on that section of railway, if you were putting in a new road or a new railway, that's a very good starting point for any of your work. Something like that, not so much. You know what, actually from here I can probably see more than normal because of how big it is, but there you go. And somewhere in between those, and this is pure self-indulgence, because I only got hold of this the other day, there's plans like that, which I think is another fantastic plan. So again, I used to live just down the road from here. We can see multiple workings in multiple coal seams overlaying on top of each other. I think there's probably a whole talk just in the detail that's on that plan for another time. And I did just put it up for self-indulgence, so I apologise. And that brings us round to deposited plan. So here we've got, this is showing the stamp and the signature on a plan to show that that is reportedly a true representation of that coal mine at cessation of working. And to be fair, that's quite a recent plan. So many of the comments that I said before probably wouldn't stand for that, but that's the sort of thing to look for. And this is the same sort of thing as I'm sure if there's any geologists in the room, we're all used to when we were getting trained to being told to get your eye in. Well, that's the sort of thing that once you've got your eye in, you spot them quite quickly. So just briefly, that's a very good representation. That's from a book by Peel, which is a fantastic book if you can get hold of it and you're interested in this sort of thing. Peel, P-E-E-L, goes through how to sink a mine, how to drive a mine, how to work the coal, and how to retreat from the mine. Super book, great book. It's a book that was written for its day. It's a guide for mining surveyors and mining engineers. Fabulous book if you can get hold of it. So we can see the main things to look at there is we've got the obvious areas of worked coal, so where the square work is. The fuzzy hatch that looks like white noise, that's an area of the workings that's been completed and has been backfilled and packed. We can see the big roadways coming through, and I'll talk about roadways a little bit now, but the next slide shows them quite well. So when we're thinking of underground spaces and these mine workings, we need to consider that we've got the workings themselves and then the means of access and egress. And they would be typically very, very well reinforced, even going back sort of pre-mechanisation, they would be very well reinforced. Peel has a whole chapter in the book about how to preserve wooden props to make sure they last as long as possible. Again, fascinating to read, but the point is that these things were built to last. And so I would challenge people who say, oh, it's all right, it was 120 years ago, it's not a problem, it'll all have collapsed. Don't be easily convinced and don't be easily fooled. Those photos were taken in the mid-1990s in the Staffordshire thick coal. You know, those are substantial props on the left-hand side. And no, it's not as open as it originally was. But if you were in that area and you were undertaking a ground investigation and you'd missed that with the borehole, and then you proof drilled and grouted or you did something else, that could really come back and get you. So if you've got a plan with a roadway on, think about targeting the roadways in any ground investigation. I think I've probably talked that one through. So interesting here is something that I didn't come across until quite late on, which is the idea of dividing the workings into districts and having coal barriers between them. So this was predominantly to stop any fire and to limit the risk of any explosion spreading throughout a whole mine. And again, this is one of those things that once you've got your eye in, it's quite easy to see on the older plans. And I think I've got another shot of that. And again, the workings being packed. Right, now, I am open to discussion at this point, maybe not a long discussion. Pillar robbing, second workings, pickings. Now, for a very long period of time, until quite recently, I considered pillar robbing to be something that was a bit ad hoc, something that was undertaken to chance their arm, to get a bit of extra coal. I'm now coming round to the idea that pillar robbing and second working are the same thing, that these mines were designed to be reworked on numerous occasions. We can see it on plans, we can see it on open cast sites. I've got a photo in a moment. So the concept of pillar robbing and second working is that we start off with something that looks like that, and we take the coal out. And then we go back and we take a bit more coal out. And in the Black Country, I've got a couple of plans. They're not here because I'm still not 100% certain what I'm looking at. But I think I've got evidence of the thick coal in Staffordshire being worked 6 times, where you can map out roadways that have gone in, that have cut through previous roadways, that are then cut by later roadways. So what does this mean in a geotechnical point of view? So if we're looking for coal in a borehole, we have to think about the percentage extraction of coal. And I know there was a case, I'll come on to it later, quite local to this, where extraction in a seam was quite an important point. But we really do need to think about extraction of coal and how that might manifest itself in any boreholes that we take, and any cored boreholes, and whether we're using cored boreholes versus rotary open holes. And the quality of the drillers that we use. We need to make sure that we have people on site who know what they're looking for in the boreholes, and make sure that the engineering staff on site know what they're looking for in the boreholes. I had a site recently in Derbyshire where the mine plans show that the coal has been completely taken out, and that wasn't necessarily reflected in the borehole investigations that had been undertaken by others. And trying to work out whether the plan was correct, whether the boreholes, which were just open holes, had possibly been logged incorrectly. Very, very challenging. So pillar robbing, second workings, anything like that. If anybody's got any stories afterwards, I'd love to hear them. And just so you know what that looks like in practice, and thank you to a younger version of Paul Roberts for this photograph. What we're looking at here is an open cast site where the overburden's been taken off. We've all seen photos like that before. And yes, it's obvious it's all been nicely cleaned up before they start working the pillars. But the important thing here to look at for me is between the foreground, the middle ground and the background is the change in the shape and the dimensions of those pillars and their footprint. And for me at the back, potentially some of those pillars have already been taken out. But then as we come through and we can see cutouts in the pillars and we can see those second workings and possibly later workings, this is completely different to what might be on the abandonment plan. And we need to think about that when we're looking at borehole records. How am I doing for time? Okay, I've put these up because these are some great illustrations of just the sort of observations and the sort of notes that you should really all be looking for on plans when we're going through. So we can, I like that, that's good, isn't it? So here we can see that mining underground was stopped because of water coming out of the face, and the surveyor has kindly actually mapped on a stream or a river at the surface so we can see where the water's coming from there. Then as we move into the top middle of the screen, we've got the dates on working, so we can see the progressive nature of the workings. And again, on some plans, there's substantial differences in those dates, and that could be interpreted as a second or third working where they've gone back in. The one on the top right, old workings at depth, fascinating, because there's no indication on some of these plans of what those old workings look like. The miners hit something, stopped working, noted that they didn't want to go any further in that particular direction. Here be dragons, but it was never mapped out. So beyond that point, we have no idea what it looks like other than it's being worked. We've got no indication of the size of the workings, no indication of the footprint. So if your site or the area that you're looking at covers that whole area, you've really got to start thinking carefully about how you're going about your investigation. And then the bottom image is going back to what I was just talking about, which is a plan showing areas divided into districts with these ribs between them to try and stop any fire or any explosion spreading. And we can see that they've been predominantly, largely, totally extracted. This is the Sanka plan from earlier. I just really like this plan. We can see a lot of things here. We can see want, which is washed out, where the coal isn't present. So the mining has been advanced to a point where suddenly the coal is completely gone. And that will be due to some depositional feature from millions of years ago. We can see the broken workings under the track, where potentially we've had second workings or later. We can see roadways that are driven without winning coal. At this point, I should point out actually, so a lot of this information comes from a very, very good NC, and I haven't got the reference, so I apologise. If anybody wants it, find me on LinkedIn. There is an NCB coal board book for surveyors which describes how to draw these plans. And if you haven't got it and you work in coal mining country, get a copy, because it is the book that is missing from the industry completely. And I intend to get a lot of that information republished through the GeolSoc over the next sort of 18 months. We can see a geological intrusion, which is marked by the green there, and we've got some spot heights. Lovely plan. I was talking to somebody earlier about this, actually. So coal would have been left in places to protect structures at the surface. I have spoken to old surveyors, old miners, I'm sure the people in the room will have an opinion on this, and I really would like to hear it later, about just how much coal was left in some of these pillars, and as to whether a few pillars may have ended up being a little bit smaller than perhaps they're shown on plans. I can say it because it's not here, but I live very close to Himley Hall. Now, Himley Hall in Staffordshire was the NCB headquarters for a number of years. Because the abandonment plan for Himley Hall has the historic church on where I got married, it's on my wall at home, much to my wife's annoyance. But what it does show very nicely is a massive pillar underneath Himley Hall. And I was talking to one of the surveyors who worked at Bagridge Pit. So Bagridge Pit was the largest pit in the area many years ago. And he said to me, oh, we took most of that pillar out. And that was the Earl of Dudley's coal mine. And it was, so fascinating. Again, love to talk to people about that if they've got any experience. This is great, but what do we do with it? We've got plans, we can interpret them, we've talked about GI, but what else should we be doing with them? We should be overlaying whatever we're going to do at the surface to try and get a better understanding. And this is a great plan. I should actually have credited this is an ACON plan, so thank you for ACON for letting me use this one. And we can see workings underneath the car park here. We can see that they don't extend over the full footprint of the car park, but they are there and they need to be considered. And then we move on to modern open cast plans. This is in the Telford area, and we can see an open cast site, and if you've not seen one of these before, the little polygons within the yellow polygon within the yellow site boundary. Those are workings that were encountered at depth in that open cast site. And it is possible, if you're really nerdy and you're really interested, to get one of these plans, try and find the corresponding seam plans and see how they compare to what was found in the open cast. And if you can get it to match, let me know, because I've never got it to match so far. I'm very, very quickly, just for completeness, going to talk about longwall working. And so we've got that total extraction that we saw earlier on the left-hand side of the screen, and then on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a much more recent plan showing the workings at Chatterley-Whitfield. Obviously, it's a very high-quality plan. It's very well drawn. It's very clear to see what's going on. But again, the reason this is up is that obviously the big polygons that have got the, I'm going to say, hopefully somebody in the room, please correct me if I'm wrong, that hatch colour is Crimson Lake? No? I think that colour was Crimson Lake that the surveyors used. That's total extraction. That coal has completely gone, and there would almost certainly have been some expression at the surface if ground conditions were suitable. That's just the same slide again. I won't go over that one. Okay, so publicly available data. Mining, yes, so this is, again, Coal Authority. This is information from the now Mining Remediation Authority. This is their freely available viewer, which I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with. If you're not, go and have a look. It's great. I've lost many an hour looking at this. It's a bit like a rabbit hole. Once you get going with it, you start looking at things, and suddenly you start looking at a site in Barnsley, and the next thing you know, you're in South Wales, and you're wondering where the afternoon's gone. The point of this slide is the two yellow vertical bars in the middle of the screen. Rob, is this your doing? This might be your doing, isn't it? I think it is. So thank you, Rob. So we can see, in fact, I'll go back. We can see that we've got two yellow bars. We've got a black hatching that denotes working. Is it workings? I can't read it there. High risk area, I think. High risk area in coal outcrops. And we can see that very clearly immediately to the left-hand side of the yellow line. But somehow there is this stark line, and the same sort of conditions aren't represented on the right-hand side. Ooh, there we go. So the development high-risk area stops. Now, as geologists, as engineers, we can all see that that's probably not the case. And I've got to defend the Mining Remediation Authority here, because this is a wonderful resource, and they don't, as far as I'm concerned, they don't pertain to know everything. But this is quite clearly where their records stop. And it's important to bear that in mind, that you need to look at the holistic area when you're looking at some of these problems, and really consider what you're looking at and what the problems might be. Because it would be very easy to interpret this and say, I don't need to do anything on this side. If I'm on the right-hand side of that yellow line, I haven't got a problem. It's fine. Okay. Right, this is where it gets fun. 10T rule. All right, is a blanket approach, in my opinion, to assessing the risk of mining voids reaching the surface. Now, I should stress before we get into this, anything I say here is really only in relation to workings other than longwall workings. There is, I think, a discussion to be had about longwall workings and the 10T rule, particularly pre-mechanisation and longwall workings, where perhaps collapse and closure didn't occur quite as well as it should have done. But generally, the 10T rule is quoted as being shallow workings at a depth of 10 times the seam thickness below the surface are not a problem to development. So from that, what I'd like you to think about is shallow workings, seam thickness, and below the surface. So what's shallow? So the Mining Remediation Authority classes shallow as being 10 times the thickness of a coal seam, down to a maximum depth of 30 metres from the surface. And then they go on to say that underground workings deeper than 30 metres do not readily constitute a threat to the surface stability due to the age of the workings and the overlying strata. Now, Network Rail consider a slightly different number. They consider 50 metres. I always love a simple graphic. So we've got shallow workings defined by 3 different organisations there, all different. So that's confusing, isn't it? And I suppose the one I particularly like is the Network Rail one, where we have to think about what are we doing with embankments, and where does an embankment get big enough to actually be a problem? And I haven't got an answer for that, to be honest, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. this is something that has come about from much debate and looking at old books and discussions within my peer group who we all kind of like this sort of thing. Worked thickness, the seam thickness. So if you're a geologist, if you're starting off, if you've never done this sort of assessment, if you've never looked at this, you read that previous statement and it quite clearly states the seam thickness. That's the number you need to be thinking about. So in most cases, you will go to a BGS map and you will look at the seam thickness and you'll do a 10T calculation. And if your seam thickness is fairly minimal, you've probably not got a problem. And that's great. But what people forget repeatedly is if we go back to those pictures that I've already put up of the timber props and the open workings, yes, let's mine a 30 centimetre thick coal seam. Great. But you've got to get there. And that's the bit that gets missed time and time again. And is that, so we've got a 30 centimetre coal seam, we've sunk a shaft, we've driven an adit to get there, however we've got there. We then want a stable means of relatively long term getting to the working face and back, pushing a cart. I'll come on to that, the cart bit in a minute. So how big is the working? So we've got a reinforced section of the seam that has got timber props in it, stone props in it, a combination of the two, holding everything up. And we need to take that into consideration, especially if we're going to be doing some sort of remedial works, because if we drill into that roadway and it is still stable, it will take a lot of grout. And equally, some coal seams may have had two roadways at different levels. And that's worth thinking about as well. So how big is a roadway? Now, a lot of this, I need to thank Keith Nichols, ex of Network Rail. Paul's chuckling because this is one of his slides. I describe very crudely the height of the roadway being the height of your wife pushing a tub. And I know that's a bit humorous, but I think that's fairly close when we're talking about old workings. And it's kind of borne out in some of these images here that we can see. So we've got the miner at the face doing the mining, and then his wife will be pushing the cart full of the coal to the bottom of the shaft or out of the adit. So surely you would only make the roadway as big as it needed to be to facilitate that. So we're probably talking, I don't know, there we go. That's me being a 17th century woman pushing a cart. Something like that, perhaps. But if you've only got a coal seam like that, suddenly your calculation, your assessment has completely gone out of the window. Very localised, admittedly. But if you've got a coal seam with a lot of roadways crossing each other, this is something that we really need to be thinking about. And then we get to this level of roadway, and this is obviously, especially the one at the bottom, much more modern, sizable construction, very well reinforced, potentially going to stay open for a very, very long time. So if we go back to a very simple ground model, and I apologise for the crudity of the image here, we've got a very simple section of strata with some coal at the bottom. I did realise when I was putting these slides together that what is missing from this slide is a roadway. So I just need you to all use your imagination a little bit, that perhaps there's a roadway at the bottom in that coal seam that's a little bit bigger than the coal seam itself. So we need to consider what the superficial materials are. We need to consider the interface between the superficial materials and rock head. And then we need to think about rock itself when we're looking at this. And then we need to think about what we're going to build. And that's really, really important. What sort of foundation? I mean, putting aside the tunnel or whatever we've got on the bottom left, what are we going to put into this ground? And are we going to change the distance between the worked coal seam and the roadway and the foundations and the zone of influence of those foundations? So suddenly we know we've got a variation in thickness, variation in what the definition of shallow is. We've got differing ground conditions. We've got coal seams which may or may not be worked at full thickness. We've got records and plans which potentially aren't correct. So all of this is very, very vague, and is not something that should have a blanket assessment approach applied to it. Discuss. And so what I'd like to say is that we need to keep making sure that we return to our desk study, refer to our approach, and if we think that we're on site and something has changed our understanding of the ground, do not be afraid to revisit where we started. My old chemistry teacher used to say that the most important word in science was why, and I think that really does apply to this. we need to be prepared to go backwards and forwards and really test that ground model. Okay, right. Pictures of things going wrong to finish on. We're going to finish a little bit, I think, on just over the hour, but I think we started a bit late. So, all very interesting, Scott. You obviously like looking at old plans. This is all old hat. Yep, great, wonderful. What does this mean for me? So just bear in mind, before we get into the fun photographs, that the Coal Authority or Mining Remediation Authority, as was, owns the coal. If we're looking at other minerals, you might find that you've got other mineral owners involved. And because the Coal Authority have got a responsibility for the coal, they report subsidence claims. And they used to report the subsidence claims, and they used to report incidences in the nice little pictorial graphic on the left-hand side. Now, in their annual reports, they just give us a number. So we've got that information on the right-hand side, which is, I had a member of staff who very kindly went through the annual records from the Coal Authority for many, many years and totted up the number of hazards and surface claims that they came to. And you're looking at roughly, I don't know, about now maybe one a day, perhaps, a little bit less than that, around that, 300 claims a year. So that's quite interesting. That's interesting, but that's just the claims. So the next piece of knowledge that we need to get is how many of those claims were actually coal-related, because some of those things included in those numbers are nothing to do with coal mining. And so that's not giving us a true picture of the risk or the hazard posed. Right, but if you do go searching on the internet, you've spent your afternoon looking at the Coal Authority viewer and now you want to change, so you're now searching subsidence, you do start getting a lot of things throwing up. And it's fascinating to look at the way the industry has responded to the Godstone incident from a few weeks ago. And I did say it on the internet, I don't know if they're in the room, I don't know if they're online, but if you're involved with writing the actual report for that job, I really feel sorry for you, because I think every man and his dog has given his opinion on the Godstone incidents and what could be going on. So best of luck with that one. Lots and lots of issues. Obviously, if you search the internet, you'll see that you get sinkholes being used when perhaps they're nothing to do with coal mining. But a lot of headlines, and they're very easy to find. And I don't really need to remind anybody here about Bayfield, but obviously this is a slide that's always in this talk for me, because I think it's fascinating. I know several people in the room were involved in this, in the aftermath of this. Terrible, terrible site, terrible, terrible problem. I won't dwell on it here, but ultimately, reconstruction costs of 3 million here. So not an insubstantial number for Bayfield, where we had houses that had gone up, people that were already living in the houses when subsidence started to occur post-construction. Terrible, terrible site. Again, exposed workings. So this is a site that I went to in Stoke-on-Trent about 25 years ago. The site had been subjected to a drilling and grouting scheme. There was a weekend of heavy rain, and suddenly things started opening up. And by opening up, I mean there were crown holes developing, the road surface was going all over, the whole road was going up and down. And it turned out that the drilling and grouting scheme perhaps hadn't quite really been designed for the ground conditions that were encountered. It had been designed by others. It was a historical scheme that had been picked up by the client. But the photos on the left-hand side show that in a road cut to try and understand what was going on, we did some trial pits and we broke into workings. Relatively, these were within 10, 12 metres of the surface, and they were still open. The photo on the left-hand side, sorry, if I'd have been foolish enough to, I could have walked into that about a minute before it looked like this. So it actually collapsed as I was getting my camera out to try and take a photo of the open workings, which is a bit of a shame, but you get the idea. And again, you can see the coal exposed there. And then we've got the same photos that we've seen before, which were in the thick coal in South Staffs. And then I put this up because I think this is great, because people talk about how quickly did subsidence occur. And I'm sure there's people in the room that have got a much better understanding of how quickly subsidence has occurred in the past. But this particular case study that myself and Rob worked on, we found, this was a section of the Sanka track. We found some correspondence going back from the 1920s to the 1960s, where the railway company would write to the mining company and say, our track's just dropped. We know you're working underneath it. What have you done? Very amicable letter. There'd be an equally nice letter back saying, yeah, we've just taken out so many panels. Leave it a week and then run the trains at top speed. And these are workings that were within 30 or 40 metres of the surface. So something that, again, interests me, if anybody's got any experience or any thoughts in the room, is in this instance, we have workings where second workings have gone in, a whole section of coal has gone out, and the ground has responded almost immediately. The letters were dated a couple of days apart. So we've got workings from 30, 35 metres moving to the surface within 48 hours. So what does the ground look like between the ground level and those workings? Has that dropped as a block? Has it deformed as it's dropped? Is it somewhere in between? Could I go and put piles into that block of ground? Could I dig shallow foundations? These are all the sort of questions that we need to be asking. Dolphin stone, I must admit at the time this one did pass me by, but this significant numbers here associated with this one. On the East Coast Main Line. Look at the numbers, 200 rotary core boreholes to investigate this, a significant piece of investigation. I've got no idea what was known about here prior to this. And in Defence of Network Rail, I've never actually asked them for them to tell me, but fascinating site. A bit closer to home, on the Northumberland Metro, on the Nexus in 2007, there was a problem that needed drilling and grouting. Leavenmouth, this was a couple of years ago. Again, machine on site, no prior knowledge, bucket into the ground, straight into mine workings. Fascinating. Fort Kinnaird, this was more recently. Again, a crown hole appeared underneath some sleepers. I apologise for a lot of these being rail related, but a lot of my experience has been rail related. So if anybody wants to give me some case studies to broaden the portfolio, they will be gladly received. And there are many others that we could talk about where mining has become a problem. And I'm going to finish on that because I'm hoping we can have a bit of a discussion. So I didn't want to put up reams and reams of conclusions, but essentially if all you take from this, if you work in consultancy, is that workings are in various forms and conditions. And the conditions on the plans may not be the conditions in the ground now. They were plans that were drawn 50, 60, 70, 100, 120 years ago. Do not trust them. Avoid the blanket assessment approaches. I'm hoping I've explained why that is. Use multiple sources of information and check that model time and time again. And if anything comes up that doesn't agree with your model, do not be afraid to go back and revisit your understanding. And on that, I'll say thank you. 10 minutes ahead for some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate you said a discussion, but...
I must admit, I'm terrifying this bit, because I knew I was coming to talk to some geologists. I didn't realise I was coming here, and the esteemed people that would be in the room.
There we are. We'll start with Norman.
Norman, I've been dreading you asking me anything.
I'm going to ask you because...
Why don't you tell me, Norman, because your opinion is probably...
No, I'll be delighted to help you in any way that I possibly can.
Thank you very much.
Away from this meeting, I would spend as much time as you like trying to enlighten people on mining in general, because that's what's lacking.
Yes.
I'm very, very sad at the moment to see the lack of knowledge that's taking place by people working in the mining industry, and that's where the Mining Remediation Authority needs to take account. That the mining is continuing. There is ground movement taking place throughout the whole of this area. It is not being monitored properly. Since 1963, the Ordnance Survey have not carried out any contouring by proper detailed levelling. And as a consequence, we are missing huge areas that are currently on the move. And we only find out when something like the track giving way on the metro line, which caused a lot of disruption, and the roadways. And this is because we haven't got the knowledge that we used to have. The last detailed levelling that took place that formed the Subsidence Engineers Handbook took place in 1963. That was when it was actually all of the basis of the subsidence calculations were based on. It's totally out of date. The other factor that's now becoming evident and people are beginning to accept it is rising mine water and the movement of rising mine water. And it's not readily understood by many people, because the mine water pond is certainly in this area, and it's happening in the Midlands now, because the Midlands is now gradually beginning to recover, and mines very much inland are being very much affected now, and that will induce further ground movement. You see here, the tides have an influence. The two waters are not connected, but the weight of the tides coming in affects the surface, which in turn affects the pond of water in the workings, and it's moving backwards and forward on a daily basis. So obviously the pillars are being affected by mine water. I could go through this with you in length. I'll be delighted if the Geological Society are trying to educate people in a proper manner. And you can't do it by producing models of what you think might be, because you've highlighted many cases. There's loads of things that happen underground that aren't being accounted for. Huge excavations for local shades, for different features underground. They're on the plans, but unless you understand that it's not just the coal seam, it's a huge, it might be 30 feet high. These are the things, that features that people need to account in modern building. But that office open. I'm delighted to spend as much time as you like in my office, and I can go through plans with you and try to show you where people are missing out.
Schoolboy. Can I try and respond to some of the things you've said there? So, perhaps not for now. I would love to have a conversation with anybody in the room about mine water heat and the idea of drilling into mines and how and some of the practicalities around that. When you talk about subsidence in the local area, Norman, are you talking about crown holes, or are you talking about more widespread, a real subsidence? Yes, completely agree with you.
What is now becoming affected or taken into account by the Coal Authority is aerial subsidence. That's where large areas of pillars collapse. And what people need to understand, if you take Ashington Colliery, for example, it mined 26 coal seams vertically in different conditions. Some of them bored and pillar, some of them long wall. But over different periods of time, you didn't start the top seam, you'd be working middle ones in different orders. How can you draw up a model for that situation? You cannot.
So just for the benefit of everybody, so myself and Paul are working with the GeolSoc. It's not got final sign-off yet, but we're looking to produce a practical, what the Geological Society calls special publication. So we've got the Syria guide that I'm sure everybody's familiar with, but whenever I give talks like this, or for the last couple of years when I've given talks like this, people have said, that's great, but what about the nuts and bolts stuff on site? And so we're going to try and capture a lot of the things you're talking about in that document. And I will reach out to you, Norman, after this, because I think we need to get your knowledge involved in that. And this, for me, this is all about knowledge transfer. And there were so many other things that you said that I want to come back to you about that I can't remember right now. So I'll catch you after this.
Sorry, Dave Granger from Sunderland. Very interesting talk. And as a black country man born and bred, although I left there a long time ago,
you can't get it out your system.
I was born in Wordsley, which is just down the road from Himley, as you know. Went to school in Brierley Hill. But yeah, I know the place you talked about, Himley Hall, of course, and Bagridge Colliery. I was probably totally illegal, it would be now. I was about 8. And my father, who ran a local youth club, took a party down Bagridge Pit, and I went along. I was about 8 years old. I can remember, going through the workings and seeing pit props, bent, that sort of thing. It stayed with me a long time. But, I mean, we've all known about the Crooked House, the pub that was demolished. That was, tilted at about an angle like that. And the doorways and windows were upright. So, unknowingly, you walked in and fell over. That was the Crooked House pub. It's a fantastic area for subsidence. There's plenty of examples, as you know, around that area. But anyway, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Thank you.
I'm sure Dudley won't adopt the tagline as Dudley, a fantastic place for subsidence.
Any other questions?
Is that there? Yeah, it is. Nice and close to your mouth.
Yeah, I was just thinking about when you were talking about the collapses in the Reading area where they worked chalk, but it's not really recorded anywhere as to where they worked it when they were doing the brick making. And I just wondered if you'd got any thoughts on that. It's 25 years, I think, since the Field Road collapse.
You're timely. I am currently working on a chalk job that I can't talk about at the minute. So come to the next talk and I'll talk all about it. Yes, so the chalk working is completely different to mining. Essentially, very, very similar to the bell pits in a large majority of the cases. Although, I'm no expert. If you want to look at the chalk, go and look at Clive Edmonds' work. The later chalk mines seem to adopt the pillar and store, the board and pillar type workings, and they are quite large. And I do wonder how many of them are fully mapped. But it's interesting you raise that because I'm quite happy to talk about this here. You'll be interested in this. For the project that I've just been working on, I ended up looking at the Arup 1990 instability database information. And I realised that not a lot of people are aware of that information, including the people that I asked to get the information from at Arup. So what I'm going to do, and what we are doing in June, is there will be a joint meeting between the West Mids Regional Group and the Midland Geotechnical Society, where Adrian Collings, ex of Arup, has kindly offered to come and talk to us about the work he did on the mining instability database. And a lot of that is chalk related. And so if you're not aware of that document, and it's almost a room full of information, it's quite a piece of work. We are going to talk about that because I think that is part of a wider conversation about lack of knowledge. Because if people don't know that information's there, it will be missed in desk studies. And so it's important to capture that. So please keep an eye out for that. I think it'll be an evening worth attending. And it'll be online.
Anyone else?
I've got some comments remotely. Angus McGregor, once again, Scott's enthusiasm shines through in his delivery. Thank you, Scott. Make sure you visit the bookshop when you are at Neville Hall and peruse the literature too.
Is it still open?
Unfortunately not,
All right.
no. Oh, the books can be bought from the bar, the ones on display in the
I like
tables.
the sound of that.
He recommends NCB Mining Codes and Rules, CR1, Surveying Practice, 1984, 59 pages and 29 figures. And then from Angus McGregor, Godstone equals Goodstone. Always clues in places' names and asking the question, what are the origins of this place? And then Angus McGregor again, Scott, I can talk to you about Dolphingstone, and the earlier Wallingford subsidence event, and Fort Kinnaird too.
Thank you, Angus. And I must say, well, Angus did a very good job of plugging this for me without being asked on the internet. So thank you to Angus.
Is there anyone else?
Paul, you're not allowed to. Oh, no, this is.
I think there's a point here in terms of records. we've talked very much about coal mining and coal mining records. And we need to understand that actually there was a complete another set of records for the non-coal mining that was held by the Health and Safety Executive. And it's those records that actually form the basis of the Arab study that you're... And it was when the government decided they were no longer holding those records that it then became part of the Arab study. And I think people need to understand that there's more than just the one set of records. You can't just go and say, well, actually, we've got... And local to here, there's actually a bridge just on the other side of the river from here that we replaced the bridge deck within an 8 hour. But actually, when we did the background study, we actually found that there was a fire clay working actually running underneath one of the abutments, and we had to work out how to treat that. And the mine plan for that fire clay working was actually at the institute here. So you've got to search all the records and all the things around.
Thank you, Paul.
Any questions? Do we have a vote of thanks? Or, no, that's all right. Well,
That's all right.
No, fear not. I shall come up with something in short notice. Well, thank you very much, Scott. That's a really excellent overview of the topic. Certainly, perhaps it will take a while for the Mine Remediation Authority to catch on properly there. I mean, a lot's been said about the educational aspects and also the mine plans. Thank you very much for making the point I was about to make, which are, don't forget that we in this institute, of course, have a lot of mine working plans, but it's excellent to see the examples you used, always showing the keen use of colouring in that needs to be taught to all the students as well. Sort of reminds me of seeing these mine plans that were still being coloured in at more hard rock mine in Sweden, and of course they went, instead of course they had the digital model, but they had everything pasted up on the office wall of their office to make sure everyone knew what was going on, so that was excellent. And then just going back to the education as well, certainly I didn't do too much in terms of geotech, and I know I've had students come up to me and say, well, it's all well and good learning about aluminium-26 isotopes in the early universe, but really, am I going to get a job? At which point I say, have you considered hydrogeology or geotechnical engineering? Please look into that. I think with that, I think my only last point is also the education. I know lawyers, when they're doing their training up in Edinburgh, one of the assessments is you have some pristine documents, but you also have some documents which have been photocopied multiple times until you can't read any of the writing. So perhaps these are excellent examples that need to be passed on to universities as well. Hopefully a special publication of the Geological Society is enough to capture all of this. Probably isn't. If you'd like to do a publication with ourselves or something jointly, then that'd be superb. We've got an increasing number of members who seem to have lots of publications coming out as well. I think hopefully if this is I can't remember the last time we had the engineering group here, but certainly hopefully the first of many more lectures to come. So thank you very much, Scott, and we'll thank him in the usual way. Oh, wow. Just to close off with some final notices. I think this Saturday at St Margaret's Church, Armstrong Road in Scotswood, there's the 100th anniversary of the Montague Pit disaster memorial service. So the remembrance starts at 10:30 till 1:30, and then 2 p.m. for the memorial service there. And of course, our next institute lecture is the 10th of April, and that's on bio leaching of critical metals. So hopefully see you all there. And if you're interested in membership of the institute, then please do corner me on the way out, and I'll pass on the details. But there we are. So thank you very much, all.